So the philosophy of compartments is basically to have a safe space in countries where you have a disease that's endemic and where maintaining a zone that is free from African swine fever, never mind country freedom, but a zone, is not going to be too easy. And let's face it, if you look at what's happening in Italy, it's not easy, even if you've got the resources. And in Africa, we don't have the resources. So it was an idea that was taken up, particularly with poultry, pigs, dairy farms, which are able to compartmentalize, to have a pretty closed system. And the compartments, unlike the zones, they operate on a very strict system of biosecurity.
Welcome, everybody, to the Swine at Canada podcast. I am Dan Columbus, and I'll be your host for today's episode. And with me today, I have a guest from the other side of the world, Dr. Mary-Louise Penrith, who is an extraordinary professor in the Department of Veterinary Tropical Diseases at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So before we get going, just because people might not know who you are, I'll just ask for you to give me a little bit of introduction to yourself, kind of where you've been and your journey so far.
Sure. Was born in South Africa, educated in South Africa, did all my training in South Africa. I first studied zoology, and I have PhDs in entomology and zoology. But when I was in my early 40s, I was able to at last realize a lifelong ambition to become a veterinarian. So I was accepted at the Onderstepoort faculty of the Pretoria University, and had a wonderful few years as a student, very mature student, made lots of friends who are still friends, and I decided, having done the course, that I was most interested in pathology, because at least you can't kill the animals any further than they already are dead, and you don't have to explain to the owners what happened. So, and also having been in research for 24 years before I started to become a vet, I realized that I wanted the answers to things, and pathology is where you get the answers. And while it may be too late for a small animal or something, it's usually not too late for a herd animals. And so my main interest, I joined the Onderstepoort Veterinary Institute after I graduated, and we dealt mainly with farm animals, almost exclusively with farm animals. And shortly after I started there, I got some pigs for post-mortem. I made the diagnosis. It was an E. coli problem, which had to do with hygiene on the farm. So I did a farm visit, and the farmer was very happy with the results. And so I was told that I should be the pig person there. And then, of course, because I'm in South Africa, I became particularly interested in African swine fever and got involved in that. So I have consulted in about 10 countries in Africa, mainly in West Africa, but also in East Africa, and as also in Georgia and Armenia in the Caucasus on African swine fever. And of course, since swine fever has gone global, I've been very involved in training programs, and we started another one today with the FAO, and people are very keen to do these virtual courses that we offer. And I've published quite a lot on African swine fever, and my main involvement is not with the commercial sector, it's actually with the resource-limited informal family sector. But of course, I am interested in the commercial sector, and I do get involved with our South African pork producer organization. So I think that's about it about me.
Swine Veterinary Partners offers a full range of animal health and production services to Canadian pork producers. We approach health management through personalized solution with concern for profitability while taking into account performance and the well-being of your animals.
I mean, it's a good lead into the topic for today, which is the African swine fever, and specifically compartmentalization and how this would affect trade. This is obviously something that is popping up all the time, and I'm looking forward to this because most of the reaction is to shut the borders, not let anything in or out, and so it seems like you're suggesting a different take. So maybe we'll just get started with what are you meaning by compartmentalization?
Well, what I'm meaning by compartmentalization is that compartments have been recognized by the World Organization for Animal Health, which used to be called the OIE. It's now the WAH, and I will refer to it as such in future, who have developed standards for compartmentalization. And the philosophy behind it is that there are countries, specifically in Africa, where we've had African swine fever. Well, it evolved there, so we don't know how long we've had it for, but we've known about it for just over 100 years. And it was, especially in Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa, it evolved in a sylvatic cycle involving warthogs and the ticks that live in their burrows. The ticks were discovered as the means of transfer later because the warthogs are so immune they cannot transmit African swine fever directly. But our country was the second one to describe African swine fever. It was discovered in Kenya in East Africa. And 7 years later, the first reports were made in South Africa of what was then known as East African swine fever. And not long after that in South Africa, in 1935, a controlled area was proclaimed because we don't have the infection in the warthogs all over the country. It's only in the northeast. That farms were then told to double fence if they wanted to keep pigs, so that they would avoid any contact with warthogs of any sort, because they didn't know at that time what sort of, I wasn't there, the sort of way in which the disease was transmitted, but they knew it was coming from the warthogs. So this area where there were outbreaks in free-roaming pigs that mingled with warthogs was declared, and people who were serious about pig farming double-fenced their farms, and those farms are now modern compartments. But from that day, from 1935 until now, those farms have never had an outbreak of African swine fever, not one of them. So the philosophy of compartments is basically to have a safe space in countries where you have a disease that's endemic and where maintaining a zone that is free from African swine fever, never mind country freedom, but a zone, is not going to be too easy. And let's face it, if you look at what's happening in Italy, it's not easy, even if you've got the resources. And in Africa, we don't have the resources. So it was an idea that was taken up, particularly with poultry, pigs, dairy farms, which are able to compartmentalize, to have a pretty closed system. And the compartments, unlike the zones, they operate on a very strict system of biosecurity. And African swine fever has a couple of characteristics which make it possible to compartmentalize. For example, it's not airborne over distances than more than a few meters, mainly in closed systems. And the oral infective dose is pretty high. There's one experiment that showed that in liquid feed it can be much lower, but that's a rather unnatural situation. So basically, most experimental studies, we haven't managed to infect them orally without a very high dose. So simple biosecurity measures, which keep your feed safe, keep infected animals from getting into contact with naive animals, and keeping fomites as far as possible out, you will not get African swine fever. And unlike a zone, it depends on the farmer. And the farmer, after all, is the person who benefits from it. And really the only difference between a zone that's free and a compartment that's free is that the compartment is a much smaller geographic area. We have more than 350 of these compartments in South Africa. The the WOH cannot possibly certify all of them. It would be impossible. So our veterinary services are tasked with certifying them, and these farms are under the supervision of a specialized pig veterinarian who visits them regularly, as well as the government veterinary services who visit them once or twice a year to make sure that everything's still working. And the biosecurity plan is very strict. And these, in the eyes of the WOAH and in their standards, a compartment is equivalent to a free zone. I don't know if that really answers your question.
It answers a couple of the questions, actually, so it's been pretty good. So, part of it was, you're mentioning biosecurity and certain things. I'm just wondering if there's more specifics that are, going into the essentials of managing compartments and making sure that, they stay ASF free or whatever the goal is.
Absolutely. And the most essential thing for managing compartments is total commitment on the part of everybody involved in the farm. No biosecurity plan, however good, is of any use unless everybody implements it strictly all day and every day, and all night and every night too, but not so much, but without cutting any corners. And this is only going to happen if everybody working with those pigs has a thorough understanding of why the measures are in place and how the disease might get in if those measures are not consistently in place, and what will happen if that disease gets in. So that is the essential part of it, that you've got to have the really good biosecurity plan, but in the end, you've got to have everybody implementing it all the time.
Yeah, it's pretty standard, I think, for most biosecurity discussions that we have, is that you can have the best plan in the world, but people need to be on board, right? And so much of that is understanding why they're doing it and what the consequences of it are, which for ASF are massive, right? If it's not controlled. So
absolutely massive.
Yeah. So I think, keeping that in mind and how difficult that can be sometimes, even when you have all the resources, if we put this on a international scale, right? Should a country that is free from ASF, like no reported cases, allow the import of products that are certified ASF free from countries where this compartmentalization has been implemented?
Well, of course, I'm going to say yes. And I'll tell you beforehand, I'm saying yes, and you don't have to worry, because we don't produce enough pork to want to export to anybody other than our very eager customers in the region who don't have as many nice pigs as we have. And they are very happy to accept us. But I'm going to say yes, because the WOH standards recognize that compartments are equivalent to free zones or countries. So they specify emanating from a free country, zone, or compartment. Although they do not individually certify them, compartments are therefore compliant with the principle of, accepting the product from compartments it would be compliant with the principle of equivalence, which is captured in the World Trade Organization Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, which is signed by all member states, which indicates that importers should accept the equivalence of safety measures, which are supported by veterinary certification that guarantee freedom from disease in the commodity to be imported. And compartments are not free of every disease, but they are certified for particular diseases. For instance, our pig compartments, are all certified for African swine fever, classical swine fever, and foot and mouth disease. And that is pretty reliable. And if there's time at the end, I prepare just a little bit about when you should or shouldn't import. Okay.
Sure. I mean, we could discuss that now.
Actually, I'm saying, why are many countries still insisting on geographic freedom for trade? Because I did attend a very interesting webinar, I was part of it, for the South American countries after Dominican Republic became infected, which is, of course, what's a big concern in your part of the world. And we had a poll which showed that most of the countries participating, which included Brazil and Canada, would compartmentalize their pig industries to protect the pigs and be able to continue business. Far fewer countries in the poll that asked, would you accept meat from a country that was endemic, but from a compartment in a country that was endemic, far fewer countries said they would do that. And I'm saying, why are so many countries still insisting on geographic freedom? And there are valid reasons, obviously, which they can use that reason, because firstly, maybe the pork's more expensive and no better than the home product, so why would you import it? The others, they don't need pork, they're producing enough themselves, and those are all valid reasons. But the other reasons are that they're not informed about compartments, they don't understand what they're all about, they don't trust the veterinary certification from less developed countries. That's a big problem. My country doesn't, and it's quite disgraceful. I don't approve at all. And the third one is they want to protect their own country, their own pig industry from competition. My country has that written all over it, which is very sad, because that is called protectionism, and it is in direct contravention of the SPS agreement of the World Trade Organization. Because compartments that are free from African swine fever are the only option for countries where African swine fever is endemic, particularly in wildlife, because although our warthogs are insignificant in transmitting the disease, they can't do it if you don't let them. But we don't want to eradicate them, so the infection is always going to be out there because they are a precious wildlife asset. And there are also countries that don't necessarily have the warthog cycle, but they have maybe insufficient resources or better ethics than to destroy all the pigs and the livelihoods linked to them in the interests of eradication. And then they're serious, progressive pig farmers get the opportunity with compartments to access markets that they could never access because of a zone not being a practical solution.
So it was interesting because you said at one point, you're not a major exporting country, and I'm wondering, so Canada is, right? And that's part of a lot of the fear of bringing anything in, right? So what would you say to countries like Canada that are largely reliant on the export market for their pork industry, and when it comes to accepting other products or doing what you're suggesting?
Well, what I would suggest is that firstly, I don't think Canada would need our pork or the pork from any of the infected countries. So it probably doesn't arise. But I do know that Canada was one of the countries that said they wouldn't accept it. And of course, that's their choice. But I mean, with us, we're producing something like, our standing commercial pig population is something like 1.5 million or so, which is not exactly an awful lot of pigs. And so we do have an export in the region, particularly to the Indian Ocean Islands and to countries like Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, who are producing pigs, but not at the level where the upper class people want to eat them. So we have that export trade, and by that time we are importing pork, and I'm afraid that Canada's had a very bad experience with us suddenly wanting to refuse anything from a country that wasn't free of PRRS, which I made myself totally unpopular with the scientific opinion, telling them they were wrong, but anyway.
Okay. So obviously, I guess, what do you say is the importance of including the supply chain in this compartment system?
It's very advisable to include the supply chain, particularly the feed suppliers, because feed is known to be a possible source of infection. Particularly if you're getting your feed from a company that is producing feed for a lot of different species, and maybe they are not being very careful about changes of clothes. If they're not part of the system, you cannot have a say over their biosecurity. But it's very often not possible to insist that they're included. For other less regular suppliers of goods and services, it might not be either possible or necessary to include them in the system, but access to compartments is highly restricted, and they're structured to enable deliveries to be made from the outside across the wall. They don't bring their trucks in or anything like that. So the main thing is the feed supplier, and I personally believe that it's extremely important to include them. We haven't legislated for that because I think it's quite difficult, and we haven't had any problems that could have possibly been related to feed. We think we've only had breaks in 2 compartments, and we think it was because the workers were allowed to bring food in. And that shouldn't be allowed absolutely ever. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So the answer to the next question might be a little bit obvious, I think, but I got to ask it anyway. Assuming a vaccine becomes available at some point, how do you see that being implemented?
okay. Vaccines are very much important to me. But I would say that I think it wouldn't be used in compartments, even at risk, because the current WOAH standards for compartments prohibit vaccination for all the diseases that they have got a standard for, including, they don't prohibit it for African swine fever because there hasn't been one, but they prohibit it even for foot and mouth disease, for which no live vaccines are available. And the problem is that the only vaccine that's sort of becoming available for African swine fever is a live attenuated vaccine. And in the last century in Spain and Portugal, they released such vaccines. All right, they didn't delete genes, they attenuated in cell culture, which means they didn't know what they had, which nowadays we do know what we have. But they caused this chronic forms of African swine fever, which make it 1,000 times more difficult to diagnose and 1,000,000 times more difficult to get rid of. We have seen the same things happening with the vaccines now. Things have happened in China that are kind of kept fairly quiet, but they happen. And we've also seen changes with the development of more virulence. And I personally, and a lot of the people involved in African swine fever, do not like the live attenuated vaccines. We think we should be waiting for something that's much safer. So far, those haven't been sufficiently protective. But even if they're not sufficiently protective, at least they're not being really dangerous. Yeah. But I think with compartments, the theory is, at least, that the biosecurity is sufficient. The other problem, if you allow vaccination, is maybe people think, the pigs are okay, they're vaccinated. We don't have to worry so much about biosecurity. This is a philosophy that we're doing our best to avoid, because it's a complementary tool. It is not a silver bullet, ever.
Well, that was not the obvious answer I thought it was, but it makes sense when you think about it, right? So coming to the end of the podcast, I'll just ask you to give a final take-home message to our listeners.
Well, I'd say that the final take-home message is that compartments are in general safer than zones. We know that the EU doesn't like them at all. They will not have them because they say it's an admission of defeat. It's an admission that you haven't eradicated the disease. That's fine. For those of us who cannot eradicate the disease, and I honestly believe that's going to be true of a very large number of Asian countries as well as us, because they have the same situation in Africa. Pigs are often being kept as a way out of poverty. They're being kept by people who don't have big resources, and the commercial farmers are at some risk from those people, and those people are always going to be out there. So to me, compartmentalization is first and foremost a way to protect pigs from African swine fever, an excellent way to protect pigs. And that is good for the welfare of the pigs and the welfare of the farmers. And at least they can access their own markets if their pigs aren't dying in heaps all the time. But secondly, I do believe that with the principle of equivalence and the fact that people can really certify and prove that they have not had African swine fever because there's testing involved, there are all sorts of things involved in their programs, I believe that it should have at least the same standing as a free zone.
No, very interesting. Definitely something to think about. So before I let you go, we have 3 more questions for you, not related to the ASF. Well, maybe they might be.
It's time for our famous 3.
Depending on your answers. So the first question we have is, what is your favorite pig-related resource?
Mainly processed products, but I'll tell you where I've had the best pork that I ever had, and that would be my favorite resource if you could get it here, which was in Georgia and Armenia, the grilled pork they have, because they haven't turned their pork into slabs of white meat. They've got a real flavor, and it's very good.
Our next question is, what is your, just give us a book or a book recommendation, something that you've read recently or in your lifetime that you really enjoyed.
About pigs or about anything?
About anything. You have free range.
Free range. My goodness, now that one really took me by surprise. I don't really know, but I guess that... I guess I like anything that has a fairly happy ending.
Fair enough. Right. That's always good. So our final one, I guess, is when you look back at mentors or pig producers or leaders that you've worked with, what is a characteristic that you think they all share that makes them particularly successful?
I think they all share a passion for what they're doing, and it's really important to them. And it's not a question of just looking for publications. It's a real passion for making a difference for the people to whom it matters most.
I definitely agree with that one. Well, it's been great having you on. Lots of interesting information. I think it'll definitely give our listeners something to think about, especially those of us in Canada, where and how maybe we treat, if we do ever get ASF, God forbid. So I'll just thank you again for coming on and joining us.
That's been a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.